Hi, I'm Michael Santos, and I'm really excited to be talking with you today about prison reform, one of the things that I really think that we need to be working on in this country. And I'm going to be asking you, all of you university students and university professors, to get involved. In fact, tomorrow, this is a test presentation I'm giving because tomorrow I'll be boarding a flight up to San Francisco from my home here in Orange County, California, flying up to San Francisco because I got to give a presentation at the University of California in Berkeley, one of America's greatest institutions, just like I'm sure all universities have something to contribute. Berkeley has really a historic it's just done so much for the United States. In fact, more Nobel Prize winners anywhere have come out of the University of California in Berkeley. And it's one of the reasons that I go up there. When I go up there and I meet with the students, I always ask them, and I'll be speaking at Wheeler Hall tomorrow in front of about 600 or 700 students. I'm going to be asking them, what was it that drove you to choose Berkeley? Because there's a lot of reasons. It could have been academics. As I said, students have won more Nobel Prizes out of Berkeley than anywhere else in the nation. Could it have been sports? I mean, Berkeley is home to some of the greatest athletic teams ever in numerous sports. It's a Division I school. And certainly a lot of students are attracted to the UC Berkeley because of the great athletic teams. But it's probably something else. It's probably something bigger. If you're choosing Berkeley to go to get your undergraduate degree, it's probably something bigger than academic or sports. It could be like Mario Savio had done back decades ago when he launched this movement to restore freedom of speech, or to bring freedom of speech, to make it a fundamental right. And maybe that's one of the reasons that people choose to go to Berkeley, because of its great historical significance in influencing social change. For example, it's very active in gay rights, and right now, the gay rights movement has gone much further than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Right now, it's legal to get married, and that would have been unthinkable 25 years ago. Berkeley has been one of the leading institutions in bringing awareness to this great social injustice. Human rights. They've got the great Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley School of Law, and it just goes to show it further advances my position that Berkeley is an institution that truly influences social change. But a lot of times, even though they have the human rights movement up there, a lot of times when we talk about what human rights mean, many students, many people can't really articulate. If I'm going to ask you, for example, what does human rights mean? How do you define it? I can tell you that universally, it's described as having freedom of association and freedom of speech. Those are two fundamental virtues of human rights. And we in the United States, we frequently are pointing our accusatory fingers at other nations for violating human rights. But the reality is, there are more than 2 million people right here in the United States whose human rights are being violated every single day. And I'm very passionate about trying to reform this great social injustice, and that's why I'm reaching out to Berkeley. That's why I'm reaching out to other universities to get involved, to do something about it. And why should they care? Because these 2.3 million people who are trapped in this system of mass incarceration are really influencing the lives of every American citizen. If you're a student, you should understand that. And my job, as I go and speak at universities and try and enlist university students to get involved in this movement, is to help them understand why and how our nation's commitment to mass incarceration has influenced the life of every American citizen. Why does it concern you? If you just look at that graph on the screen, you can see how our prison system has had this hyperbolic growth rate over the past several decades. It wasn't always this way. Prior to the early mid-1970s, prior to the war on drugs, our nation incarcerated people at roughly the same rate as other civilized nations. Now we lead the world in the number of people we incarcerate, and it influences every American citizen. How? Just look at that spending pie chart. When the movements began in the early 1980s towards this growth of this massive prison system, you've seen prison spending grow by 436%, according to the Department of Bureau of Statistics. It's right available on your Google search as I found it. Higher education spending, meanwhile, has dropped by 13%. So if you are a university student and you're wondering, why don't you have access to very much financial aid or as much as you would like to have? Why are your student loans having to be so high, frequently measured in six figures? It's because there's not as much money going into the educational system as there is much flowing into the massive prison industrial complex. And it's my job to try and bring awareness on how sentencing and prison reform could help change that. It's my job to try and help you understand why our nation's commitment to mass incarceration is such a great social injustice. And it's an injustice that's spread not equally across the platform. You can look at these charts here, and we measure this system in per 100,000 people in the population. If we look at white people per 100,000 people in the population, 678 white people for every 100,000 are incarcerated. Contrast that with the number of Hispanics, 1,775 people per 100,000 people. Contrast that with the number of black people, 4,347 people for every 100,000. And if you're between the ages of 19 and 29 or 39, it's significantly higher. In some cities, 50% of the population are under some form of the criminal justice system if they're between that age group. And that is just a massive social injustice that influences the lives of every American citizen. What are the beginnings of this prison boom? When did it start? Some of you may be too young to remember, but I was incarcerated at that time. So I remember this time when Newt Gingrich was leading the House of Representatives and talking about this contract with America and talking about the need to build more prisons. That movement really launched us into this stratosphere of becoming the world's largest number of people, becoming a country with the largest number of people incarcerated. But now things are changing. We have President Obama, the first president ever to visit a federal prison. And why did he visit it? He visited because he recognizes this is a massive problem where we are incarcerating more people per capita than any place else on earth. It costs an enormous amount of money. Not only does it cost us in terms of money, but it costs us in terms of social capital. It costs us in terms of weakening the fabric of our nation. Why? Because children are growing up no longer stigmatized by prison, but in some communities they're actually glorifying the system. These are the ancillary consequences of incarcerating 2.3 million people. And that's why now is the time to truly get involved, to truly change something, to truly make a difference. And how can you do it? Well, you can do it by mentoring some of the people who are either going into the prison system, people who are in the prison system, or people who are coming out of the prison system. That's one significant step that you can take as an individual to help end this great social injustice, this great system that perpetuates intergenerational cycles of recidivism. You can start sowing seeds through education that will help people build a brighter future. You can start working to help employers understand why they should hire formerly incarcerated individuals if those formerly incarcerated individuals have truly reformed their life and can demonstrate their commitment to bringing value to society. You can but through this effort, we can build safer communities where we don't have this revolving door where individuals who are going into the prison system can't stop themselves from coming out of the prison system. This is a massive, complex social problem. And in order to solve this social problem, we need assistance and contributions from different sectors of society, including teachers who should help students understand why this is a great problem. Those students and the teachers together will help the media get involved and spread more awareness so that we can influence the narrative, influence the conversation. Lawyers should get involved. Politicians should get involved. All taxpayer and citizens should get involved. Why? Because this problem influences the life of every American citizen. If you've got an elderly parent who needs medical attention, well, sometimes those medical budgets are being cut. Why? Because too much money is flowing into this system of imprisonment. And that money that's going into imprisonment is not not furthering corrections. It's not preparing people for law-abiding, contributing lives, but rather it's perpetuating this intergenerational cycle of failure that I feel so passionate about working to spread awareness on why we can change. And why am I so passionate about wanting to change those? It's because I am very familiar with a cell like that. You see, I served more than 26 years in federal prisons across America. I've been out for just about 2 years right now. I was released in August of 2013 is when I concluded my obligation to the Bureau of Prisons. And some of you may be asking, what type of horrific crimes did I commit? Well, I can tell you, when I was 20 years old, I just started making some bad decisions. I started hanging around the wrong crowd. I was influenced by, a guy who I used to consider a role model. My father's a Cuban American, and when I saw this movie Scarface and Al Pacino playing Tony Montana, I really thought it would be kind of cool to live that lifestyle. And I moved to South Florida. I began trafficking in cocaine and transporting that cocaine from South Florida to Seattle and various cities in between. And, it was a very bad decision. I wasn't as bright as all of you students who are in college right now. I was a kid who was chasing a fast life, and of course there are consequences that follow those bad decisions that I made. And there came a time on August the 11th, 1987, I was 23 years old, and I was arrested. I, of course, had to hire a defense attorney, and I hired some guy kind of like this one that says, "Better Call Sal," that's on television right now. I didn't get good guidance. Don't blame anybody but for myself, because I hired a lawyer who told me exactly what I wanted to hear. And the only thing I cared about at that time in my life, like many other people who are initially incarcerated, is just getting out of jail. And so it was a consequence of that I did make a series of bad decisions even after my arrest, where instead of accepting responsibility, instead of feeling remorse for the bad decisions that I had made, I chose to put the government to the test and went to trial. And God, what a terrible decision that was. But fortunately, after I was convicted, I found some new mentors, some new influences in my life. It began when I read the story of Socrates. I was sitting inside of a jail cell. At that time in my life, I didn't know anything about philosophy. But when I'm reading this story, all of a sudden it spoke to me, and it convinced me that I need to use my time in here to begin positioning myself in ways that I can reconcile with society, that I can come back someday and add value. But I received a 45-year prison sentence when I was 23 years old. I didn't even know what that meant, 45 years. I mean, I'd barely been alive. I was 23 years old. I was in high school just a few years before. But now I'm saddled with this 45-year prison term. Fortunately, I was sentenced under a time that the sentencing laws are different from what they are today, and I was able to satisfy that sentence in 26 years. But even 26 years, how do you comprehend it? It's very difficult when you're 23 years old. To put it into perspective, right now, this is 2015. If somebody were to be arrested right now in 2015 and they were 20 years old in their early 20s and they were going to serve the same length of time that I served, they wouldn't be getting out of prison until 2041. So, it's very difficult to comprehend what it means to serve 9,500 days in prison, but I did that in prisons of every security level. And I'm fortunate because I had this commitment. I was influenced by Socrates, and it obsessed me. It put me on this obsessive path to focus on educating myself, to focus on contributing to society, to focus on building a support network. And it is through that contribution that I believe that commitment, that disciplined, deliberate path that allowed me to believe if I do this every single day, as these days turn into weeks, as these weeks turn into months, as these months turn into years, and the years turn into decades, if I can execute this plan, I would have a better future when I concluded my obligation. And I had to do so in tough conditions, much more difficult than the students at UC Berkeley or at any other university. I was in cells like that with people who were living without hope. And that's why I can identify with those individuals. That's why I can empathize with them and understand why so few of them are able to muster the discipline and the energy and the commitment to prepare for success, because they're living in these environments that extinguish hope, that keep these cycles of failure going. And I consider myself blessed and fortunate that I was able to overcome that. And that's why I feel so passionately about working hard to reform our nation's prisons, to reform sentencing, Because I was inspired by masterminds. I was able to reject the negativity of those environments and learn from people like Steve Jobs, who told us so much and who taught us so much. In fact, I'll always remember one of the lines that he said. He said, "Good artists steal ideas, but great art," I strike that. He said that good artists copy ideas, but great artists steal ideas. And that was all that I wanted to do. I wanted to steal ideas from masterminds, from leaders who have lived and contributed to society, who overcame struggle, who overcame challenges, because the reality is, we all as human beings face struggle. We all as human beings face challenge. My struggle happens to be told through the context of serving at 26 years in prison, but the reality is, if you are suffering outside, if you've lost your job, if you've lost your marriage, if you are struggling with obesity or substance abuse or financial affairs, it can feel confining like a prison. And there's a path to break through it. And it's my job to try and show people how to break through it. I learned from masterminds like Nelson Mandela, who suffered great social injustice and imprisonment for even longer than I served. He was in for 27 years, and I was always inspired by him. Why? Because when I was going in to begin my term, Nelson Mandela was coming out. But instead of having bitterness and anger because of the injustice of his incarceration, he came out as a global leader, revered by all humanity because of his great compassion, his great sense of belonging. I was inspired by Viktor Frankl, an individual who was incarcerated during Hitler's Nazi concentration camps, but instead of coming out bitter after watching his family being executed, he came out with this great commitment to inspire other people, to help other people become better. I was inspired by Gandhi, who really believed in changing the world through resistance to violence. I was inspired even by this individual who is an icon at Berkeley, Savio, who really brought the message of free speech and the importance of communication. But the reality is, there are so many people in prison who are having that human right squashed. I mean, I came out of prison in 2013. After 26 years, I'd never seen the internet. I've never used the internet. I'd never sent an email. I'd never used a modern cell phone or any of that type of stuff. And I know that people inside who are being deprived of access to technology, their human rights are being violated because they're coming out and they will not know how to function in this world where all of these tools are so essential. And we're facing obstacles from behemoths like private prison companies that profit from incarcerating individuals. And these companies fuel budgets for lobbyists, and they control the narrative, talking about the need for more imprisonment rather than less. We've developed this massive prison ecosystem where companies profit from overcharging prisoners on telephone calls, by charging them, by making the burden on their families. And so many businesses profit from this, and taxpayers don't understand that's part of the reason why we incarcerate more people than anybody else on the planet. It is because there's so much money flowing around it, and voices are quashed, which is why I am reaching out to universities and asking you to take action, to get involved, to understand that 2.3 million are incarcerated today, but this system won't stop until it incarcerates you or your loved ones or your children or somebody that you know. And that's when it becomes too overwhelming. That's when it begins to affect you personally. But I want to stop this movement, or at least shift the movement, so we'll use a smarter criminal justice system than the one we currently have. And I get inspired by things about how they can break the cycle. How can we do it? Well, we can do it just as for hundreds of years until the great Arab Spring, where people came together and stopped governments from their oppression, or at least started to move the needle to ending tyranny. How did they do it? How did they break that cycle when decades of war and killing and so on couldn't do it? How did they do it? They used social media by spreading the message. And that's what I'm asking university students to do, to get social. Get involved. Help me bring awareness on why we need to stop mass incarceration, on why we need to work together to open opportunities for those who are going into the prison system, those who are serving time in prison, those who are emerging from prison. Let's work together in ways that will help those people emerge as law-abiding, contributing citizens. I want people who want to work for social change, just as I do. I served 26 years in prison, but I'm still out here striving and fighting to bring awareness, to bring news on what we can do. And I do it through my podcast, the Earning Freedom Podcast, where I share my own strategy about overcoming in prison, my own stories, and I also interview other individuals. But I need help because I'm trying to pipe these podcasts into prisons across America. I need help because I need to get this message out, which is why I'm calling for all of you students in Berkeley and students from across the country. If you want to be an intern, reach out to me at michaelsantos.com. Let me co-opt you into working towards sentence and prison reform and spreading awareness on why we need to change this system. I'm urging you to make a difference. Intern with me and help me schedule guests for the podcasts. Help me improve my social media strategy so that more people can become aware on why we need to change this system. Get involved in my Hootsuite and Pipedrive campaigns. And when you're doing this, you will do a couple of things. You will learn more about the greatest social injustice of our time. You will help me connect with prisons and schools and other organizations that can benefit from this program. And you will also be developing an awareness, and you will help change the world, which is really why you went to school, went to the university in the first place. So if you can get behind this, reach out to me. Reach out to me at michaelsantos.com if you would like to intern for me. I will create a process that your professors can sign off on and that you can begin sowing seeds for a better world. Join me with these small actions to change the world. Thank you very much. I am Michael Santos with the Earning Freedom Podcast, and I'm hoping to hear from you.